What's going on, draft junkies? Welcome to the BackDraft podcast. I am your host, Chris Bengal. I am joined by my co-host, Ryan Struve. We're here to bring you all the drafts of the past, talk about everything that went down in the drafts of yesteryear. We're back once again, and today we're going to be breaking down the 2003 NBA draft, one that shaped the NBA for years to come and honestly still is, with one of the top players in the game still going strong at 40 years old. And we're going to dive into all the action. So, Ryan, how are you on this fine day?
It's good. This is a Thanksgiving episode of Backdraft. I neglected to mention last time. I thought our last episode was our best yet. To be quite honest with you,
Absolutely
um,
was.
and we're actually coming live in the same house. We're not in the same room right now, but Chris is actually at my house for the holiday, and so we get to chat about this a little bit beforehand. There's a lot going on out there. This is an NBA draft that we're breaking down today, so we should probably talk a little bit about the NBA. I mean, the Oklahoma City Thunder are 17-1 to start the season. I think I think Gilgeous Alexander has sat for 11 fourth quarters out of those 18 games, which means they've been just boat racing all of their opponents. You think there's any chance that they sort of flirt with that, all-time best season mark?
I think there's always a possibility. Obviously, you look at the talent of this team, they're doing all of this even with Jalen Williams on the shelf. Um, you know, SGA winning the MVP last year, the Thunder winning it all, and you know, coming in this year, nothing has changed. Look like the same well-oiled machine, just the deepest team that you can imagine. And I don't think there's any reason to think that they can't make a run at that. But as you get later in the year, if for some reason they have that number one seed locked up, are they going to start sitting guys for games? Are they going to kind of be content in where they're at and not want to need to go for wins if they have that number one seed locked up? So maybe that 73 win plateau isn't something that they need to go for. I think that's the only thing that might hold them back at this point. So I think it's all going to come down to where they're at late in the season at this point.
Yeah, I mean that 15-16 Warriors team was so loaded. The Thunder are loaded as well. Is there any other team in the West that you think could even challenge them if they got late in the season or in the playoffs?
Yeah, I mean, there's really not a lot of teams if you look at it right now that as it's currently constructed, like that could give them a run for their money. Obviously, Denver's always in that conversation. You have, kind of had a down year last year, but when you have Nikola Jokic, they've had a few injuries. I know they have Christian Braun out right now. Did ship Michael Porter Jr. out in the offseason and have some tweaks, but I'd like to think that they'll make some changes probably at the deadline. The Lakers are always in that conversation as well. LeBron recently returned. Obviously, when you have LeBron and Luka, anything's possible. Rockets as well are, bringing Kevin Durant in the offseason, you know, as they develop more chemistry, I think can make some noise. But I think the gap between the Thunder and everyone else is pretty substantial right now until I think I'm proven otherwise. I think the Thunder are clearly the team to beat. And frankly, I don't think it's that close.
Yeah, I would probably agree with that. Um, on the other side, the Pistons on the other side of the conference, or the other conference rather, Pistons have been playing really well as well. Uh, what do you think about the East and how that shakes out?
I think the East is much more wide open. If you look at the standings at the moment, I don't think that's really how it's going to shake out. You look at your top three in the East are the Pistons, Raptors, and Heat. I don't think the Raptors and the Heat are who's going to be, standing near the top when the regular season ends. Obviously, the Cavs had a sensational regular season last year. I think they'll be right there. I think the Knicks, who have, had Brunson out for a little bit, I think they'll be right there. I think the Knicks definitely can win the East. I think that's probably Detroit's biggest competition. I think those are probably the two teams. I think the Pistons and Knicks that I would say have the best chance to come out of the East. Um, I just think you know the East is kind of down this year, and I think there's only really a few teams that kind of have the firepower to make it out and would really have a chance to give the Thunder a run for their money. And I think, are the Pistons ready to take that next step? We'll see throughout the year, but I think the Knicks and Thunder, if that were to be the finals, would definitely be a fun series.
Yeah, I think everybody's looking forward to that. I don't know that the league necessarily wants a Detroit and Oklahoma City final. They love
Definitely.
it when it's LA versus New York or something like that. But from a basketball perspective, that would be certainly be a lot of fun to watch Cade Cunningham go against Gilgeous Alexander in the
Absolutely.
finals. Switching over to the NFL, we'll touch a little bit on that. We don't really have a team this year that is just out there destroying teams. Usually, we have one team that's 10-1 or 11-0 and really putting the hammer down on the NFL. The standings are all over the place. I mean, if the playoffs started today, the Lions and the Chiefs wouldn't be in the playoffs. The Commanders, who were really good last year and in the NFC Championship game, wouldn't be in the playoffs. No surprise that the Giants have been eliminated from playoff contention, but we have the Patriots and the Rams sitting on top of the NFC and AFC standings right now. If you had to do a power ranking, Chris, where would you stack up the teams in the NFL, either by conference or just the NFL in total in terms of who's the favorite? Because it kind of seems kind of wide open right now.
It really does. It's really been an entertaining season to this point, but I think it's got to start with the Rams. I think, especially after the Eagles going down this week to the Cowboys, you know, going up 21-0 and seeing that lead slip away and losing that game, I think the Rams are clearly the favorite, especially after absolutely dismantling the Bucks. Game was over well in hand by halftime, and just looked like such a complete unit. That offense is absolutely clicking on all cylinders. Stafford's having playing some of the best football of his career, which seems crazy to say, but I think it's accurate to say that. And Puka Nakua is just sensational. Devontae Adams continues to play well, even at this point in his career. And Kyron Williams and only had two carries in the first half, whatever it was. They don't even need to run the ball sometimes because that offense is just so electric and just kind of go up and down the field, do whatever they want. So I think the Rams have to be at the top. I still think the Eagles are right there. They've had the offensive issues at times this year, but that defense is just so stingy at times and can shut any offense down. I still think those two teams are could be on a collision course in the NFC title game. And then, if you flip over to the AFC, it's hard to go against the Patriots the way Drake May has played, the way that defense has played. Mike Vrabel's really got those guys believing and playing well. Obviously, the Will Campbell injury on the offensive line is something to watch. If he ends up being out long term, that's something that's going to hurt the Patriots in a big way. But the Patriots are definitely the team to beat in the AFC right now. And if you look at it, the Chiefs got a huge win this week against the Colts. Kind of if they don't win that game, go to 5-6, and that could have been a statement game for the Colts if you're looking at it from the other side. So, wide open AFC, I think. If like I said, if that Campbell injury ends up looming large, it could get real interesting in the AFC.
Yeah, never good to see your left tackle go down like that, especially as well as they're playing. I memean, in particular, they're 6-0 on the road, and I mean they're the number one seed right now in the AFC if it started today, so they wouldn't have to play a road game. But I think the way that they play, especially their defense, I think that would travel well if they had to ultimately go on the road and play a road game. And I agree with you on the Rams on the NFC side. And what's in particular impressive to me is what their defense is doing. Like they played a pretty good team on Sunday night, and their defense was just all over them. I mean, sure, Baker Mayfield got injured and had to go out at halftime, but even before that, like their defense, they're the number one scoring defense in the NFC. So you can start there. They're not allowing a lot of points, but just they bring so much pressure on the quarterback just by bringing three or four guys with Nate Landman and Jared Verse and Braden Fisk and Kobe Turner. Like they're constantly putting pressure on the quarterback. And if your O line isn't up to the task, or your running back isn't a particularly good blocker, which I honestly don't know if Kyron Williams is a good blocker or not, but that allows them to drop so many defensive backs back and cover for a much longer period of time. So obviously it starts with Stafford at the top. If he were to go down, I mean, they do have a good backup. They have Jimmy Garoppolo, but it starts with him. But that defense has been just overpowering teams, and even good teams like the Buccaneers, like we think the Buccaneers are. So let's get into the draft a little bit. Yeah, as you mentioned at the beginning of the episode, the 2003 NBA draft, certainly a landmark draft in the history of the NBA. Why don't you kick it off for us? What set the scene for us on this draft?
Yeah, so this draft was obviously one of the more iconic ones that we've seen in the NBA throughout history. One that was, one of those ones where everyone knew, no matter who got the number one pick, it was widely known who was going number one. It was the year LeBron James was coming out. He was going number one. That was back when high school players could jump right to the NBA. He was this polarizing prospect from Akron, Ohio, St. Vincent St. Mary's High School. One of the most decorated prospects probably that's ever come out. I mean, a guy that had his high school games broadcasted on ESPN. I mean, just thinking about that just seems insane. I mean, obviously now, that happens with some, high school football games and basketball games, but I think back then it was not as common, and just a super polarizing player, and what he was bringing to the table was absolutely insane. You know, super interesting fact that I didn't know, and kind of researching for this episode was Time Warner Cable tried to capitalize on his insane popularity by giving fans a chance to kind of watch his games on a pay-per-view. $7.95 a game they tried to charge, but it ultimately didn't end up being profitable. But I found that absolutely insane.
Imagine paying pay-per-view prices to watch a high school basketball game.
To watch an 18-year-old or 17-year-old play basketball. That's
Yeah, I
nuts.
mean, he would have been the number one pick as a junior, I think, as if he came out, as
Oh,
a junior, and he might have been as a sophomore. I mean, you never really know. He was just a different kind of player. I remember the hype for him coming out, being because I was in grad school at the time, so I was a young man, and the hype for him was unlike anything I had seen. Maybe the most obvious number one pick in a draft ever. Like, I can't think of any draft in any sport where it was more obvious who was going to be the number one pick in that draft. And so weird that the Cavaliers, I mean, they were the worst team in the NBA the year before. And so they had the highest odds of getting that pick. But even still, for them to get a pick for a quasi hometown guy who grew up in Ohio was sort of kismet, and obviously leads the conspiracy theorists to believe that there's some conspiracy in the NBA
The
to,
frozen
you know,
envelope.
yeah, the frozen envelope from Patrick Ewing and all this kind of. I don't know. Do you put any credence in those conspiracy theorists?
I mean, I don't put a lot of stock in it, but I mean, the fact that the the Cavs do get it that year, but on the other hand, I mean, they were absolutely terrible at that time, so it's not like it's they were like a fringe playoff team and somehow ended up with LeBron James. Like it's not far fetched that they got the number one pick. So I don't think I put a ton of stock in it.
Yeah, and obviously, I think he may be the best because you think of some of the other like all-time NBA greats, like Michael Jordan was not a number one pick. Some of the other all-time greats weren't number one picks in the draft. Um, but he was. He may be the best example. Kobe Bryant wasn't a number one pick. He was sort of a mid-round pick, I believe. Um, he might be the best example of hype and living up to the hype because he was this uber hyped prospect. They made Upper Deck, I think, made a card series for him when he came out into the draft, which had never been done before for an individual player. Um, or Panini did, I think, maybe. Um, and so everybody thought he was going to be great. And usually when that happens, like, yeah, maybe they're good, or they might even be great. But he almost like beat the hype. He was almost better than the hype coming into the league.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's. It's hard to imagine any player that has ever outproduced their draft position more than that. I mean, you know, the debate always is going to be, who's the greatest player ever, him or Jordan, whatever side of the fence you want to be on. There's no denying that LeBron is in that conversation and has every right to be. And, you know, what other great players have went number one? Really, no one. Kobe was eighth overall. Yeah, like you said, Hakeem wasn't a number one pick. All those guys were not in that spot. So he, surpassed every barometer that was possible. And you think of the insane amount of pressure that he had from the moment he was, 15, 16 years old, probably, you know, on ESPN constantly on the cover of all these magazines, had all this media attention from, the moment he, was in high school. I mean, that's, an insane amount of pressure. And, he outperformed everything. And at 40 is still going strong. So, I think he's surpassed every bar that is imaginable and is arguably the most complete player that has ever been seen in the history of the sport, I think.
Yeah, I mean, he kind of broke the NBA in a way. Like he came into the league he's 6'9", but and so was like Magic Johnson. Magic Johnson was 6'9" and kind of broke the NBA because he was this big, tall, point guard who could really pass the ball. And back then, point guards really weren't that tall. They were more like 6'3" to 6'6". And LeBron comes in at 6'9", which is the same height as Magic, but he's a much bigger person. Like his playing weight is like 250. He's like a linebacker or a big tight end in the NFL. And you can't convince me for a moment that he wouldn't have been a superstar in that sport too if he'd wanted to play football, just given his hands and size and other intangibles. But he with the kind of ball skills that he had at 6'9" and that big, like he could go down and post up guys. That I think kind of changed the NBA because now if you're 6'9", like you're kind of a small forward, and you better have some ball skills and be able to shoot threes. Whereas back then, a 6'9" guy wouldn't necessarily have to have those skills to go out on the perimeter or beat guys off the dribble.
No, and if you think about it, LeBron's not. He's a good shooter, but I wouldn't say he's a great shooter. And he did use his size to his advantage over the years, and still does. He's not a guy that he's not a Steph Curry that chucks up 10 threes a game. He's a guy that plays within his limitations. Like he can back guys down. He bullies guys. He gets to the rim. He you know, excels in transition. He really can do it all, and even still is, and a fairly above average player for, in his, 20 whatever season he's in at this point, and, still is, I think, a fairly above average player, and, just continues to wow people, and I think still has the Lakers as a contender in this at this point in his career. It's really amazing what he's put together, and like you said, I don't think there's any doubt that this is probably the best draft pick in any sport in any era, and I don't think you can really even debate that at this point.
Yeah, and he's a good defender. Like that's what they always say about Michael Jordan is what kind of separates him from the other all-time greats is he was an elite offensive player and also an elite defensive player. LeBron, he's a six-time all-defensive player and he could guard all five positions. Like you could have him guard a center. Yeah, he would give up a little bit of size, but he also was fast enough and had long enough that he could guard a perimeter player if he had to. Without dwelling too much on LeBron, I think we've given him his flowers here. What about the rest of the top of that first round sticks out to you, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, it's super interesting how loaded the top five truly was. Obviously, you moved down to number three. You've got the Denver Nuggets taking Carmelo Anthony out of Syracuse. Had one of the more spectacular single seasons that we've ever seen in college basketball. I think leading Syracuse to the national championship. Carmelo kind of made it clear that he was going to play at least 2 or 3 seasons in college, but then kind of accomplished everything he wanted to. Won a national title and kind of was did everything that he wanted to and made the jump to the NBA. Ends up with the Nuggets and goes on to have this historic career as this super talented scorer and you know ends up with the Knicks for a time as well, and maybe not an elite shooter, but just definitely one of the more gifted scorers that we've seen. Ended up 10th on the all-time scoring list, and just a super impressive player.
Yeah, he kind of willed that. I remember watching that NCAA tournament. He was definitely the star of that tournament. Um, and I think he was clearly the best player on that team. He kind of willed the players, willed that team to the national title. I don't think anybody would confuse Carmelo with like an elite defensive player, but certainly one of the most gifted offensive players, in the last few generations of players.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. I don't think, obviously a guy that never won a title, anything like that, and kind of, once he kind of hit his decline towards the end with the Knicks, that was kind of it. Bounced around with a couple other teams, Blazers, Thunder, and, kind of tailed off from there. But, he, had a Hall of Fame worthy career and believes in the Hall of Fame now. Was
Never won a
always
ring though, right?
No, never won a ring. I think he was on the Thunder team when I think Westbrook was still there, and I think when it was Westbrook and like Paul George and all that. He was like the third piece, but not um, you know, at that point was kind of a shell of himself, and was not, certainly not the scorer that he used to be. And, you know,
Yeah, and Chris Bosh and Dwayne Wade are the next two picks after Carmelo, and we're going to talk at length about Darko Milicic because I think that's the most interesting pick of the entire draft, honestly. But Bosch was on a team. I didn't realize this until we started looking into this. Now that Georgia Tech team he was on was really not that good. They didn't even make the tournament that year.
no, he it was. I mean, the fact that he rolled himself into a top five pick was pretty impressive, especially playing on such a bad team. And Georgia Tech is also not really a basketball powerhouse
Yeah, I
usually.
wonder why he went there. I mean he averaged I don't know 20 and 10 ish for that team, and I think they were about a 500 team. They went to the NIT and lost in the semis or something that year, but he didn't have that tournament to help boost him up. But clearly the draft people at the time, the analysts and the scouts clearly saw enough to move him to the top of the first round. And Dwayne Wade, I mean, his Marquette team, they made the Final Four of that tournament. I think he did move his draft stock up quite a bit. He was, I mean, the knock on him was that he was small, right? Like 6'4". Even in the NBA at that time, 6'4" was kind of small and kind of slight in stature. And I don't think people thought that he was going to be able to not hold up, but he wouldn't be physical enough to be as good of a player as he was.
Yeah, I don't think Wade. I mean, Wade. I don't know where he would have gone otherwise. I don't know where he was exactly slotted before that season, but I mean, his draft stock absolutely shot up that year after that deep run that they went on. I don't think anyone had Marquette making that deep of a run, and that was I do remember watching that at the time, and they were kind of the team that a lot of people rooted for. They were kind of that Cinderella team that a lot of years that people get behind and want to root for. He was not really viewed as like an uber athletic player. He was kind of a gritty type of guy, and not maybe not an elite athlete, but over the years was the strong finisher that was able to get into the lane and finish strong. Was never an above average shooter by any means, so kind of had to rely on his ability to finish, his ability to facilitate, and things like that. So obviously it helped, especially when they ended up forming the big three. Definitely helped playing with guys like Bosh and LeBron, and was able to kind of take some of that pressure off of him. But also won a ring with Shaq when he was in Miami back in the early 2000s. So he had ended up having an amazing career.
Yeah, no, he definitely did. I mean, he was not this like superstar prospect. I mean, he played 3 years at Marquette. He wasn't a one and done guy like Bosch and Carmelo. Um, and he wasn't obviously wasn't good enough to come out out of high school, which was allowed at the time. And there's some other guys in that first round. Who else would you want to talk about it at any length in that first round? Chris Kaman was picked sixth. He had a nice long career as a big guy.
Yeah, I mean, drafted, maybe fairly high, but ended up being a solid center. Started on some teams, Clippers for a length of years, and even later in his career was a solid backup. Just gave you solid minutes at the center position. Got boards and was gave you those minutes that you needed. Was not flashy by any means, but was a solid player that any team would like to have. I think pick 7, the Bulls grabbed Kirk Heinrich. Sure, maybe for what he ended up being, maybe 7's a little high, but I mean, he ended up being a super serviceable point guard, great 3-point shooter, great passer, just kind of the kind of glue guys that you need on a good team, on a good playoff team. And I think over the years he ended up being, a guy that you want in your backcourt. Um, I think just a really solid player.
Yeah, I think his draft stock got elevated by Kansas's run in that tournament. He was a 4 year player. He was a senior coming out of Kansas, um, and a really talented point guard for them. But was kind of a backup in the NBA. I think.
Who else do we have? David West out of Xavier, big man. Ended up having a pretty lengthy career. Played 15 seasons. Ended up being taken by the Hornets when they were in New Orleans. Played for a few teams. You know, It's a pretty solid kind of fringe. Power forward center. You know, like I said, was pretty solid over the years. Boris Diaw's another one out of France. Won a ring with the Spurs in 2014. Kind of a pretty solid sharpshooter, big man. Was kind of would be kind of a glue guy in a lot of those championship teams. Just a guy you'd like to have. Um, Anybody else that you like in this class?
Well, I want to hear your take on Steve Blake because you're a big Maryland fan, and he came out in this draft and was picked, early in the second round or mid second round, by the Wizards and played here for a while. I don't think he had a particularly remarkable NBA career, but what did you think of him at the time, given that you were such a fan?
Yeah, Steve Blake was obviously a member of the 2002 Maryland National Championship team. I mean, that backcourt was iconic for any Maryland fan. That's the team that everybody loved. Steve Blake and Juan Dixon, Lonnie Baxter. It was a lot of fun for any Maryland team to watch. But both Dixon and Blake ended up getting drafted to the Wizards. Ironically enough, Blake went 30th overall that year. Um, I mean, ended up having a solid career. Was mostly a backup point guard. Played a couple years with the Wizards. Spent some time with the Blazers. Was uh, Played for the Lakers for a handful of years. Clippers as well. You know, I think for what he was a serviceable, kind of backup point guard, stabilized the bench most places that he was never a flashy guy. He, dish out some assists. He, kind of mentor some of the young guys, things like that. Like just do the little things. He's never a guy that was going to come in and, he's not going to drop 25 points or anything like that. He was never, even in college, he was more of a, he was not the guy that was going to carry the scoring load. I mean, obviously scored a little bit more at Maryland than he did in the NBA, but that was more, Juan Dixon and some of the other guys when he was with the Terps. But, for what he was, he ended up having, pretty strong career and, made himself, a good amount of money.
He certainly did, and I think the other, the other player worth mentioning, maybe the steal of the draft, late in the second round, the Nets, and they ended up trading this player to the 76ers just for straight up cash, which I didn't know that you could do. It was Kyle Korver, who played at Creighton. He played 4 years at Creighton. He was a senior when he came out of Creighton, um, and was I think a good player for Creighton. I mean, he averaged 15ish points a game or something like that. Um, I think he was boosted in that last season for Creighton because he shot almost 50% from 3 point, which obviously the college three is in closer than the NBA three, but still shooting 50%, or he shot 48% from three that year, and got a lot better as his college career unfolded. I think that probably caught the attention of the scouts, and had a really long, really productive career in the NBA. And even now, even after the Steph Curry kind of explosion of shooting threes, he's still a top 10 all time 3 point maker in the NBA. I think he's eighth right now on the all time list of 3 pointers made. Any players that weren't drafted that are worth discussing?
Yeah, there's really only one. Looking at the list, there's a lot of names that I didn't even ever really heard of or didn't even remember. Toronto Raptors did scoop up Jose Calderon, veteran point guard, ended up playing 14 seasons in the league. Averaged like 9 points a game, 6 assists, just about. Mostly played with the Raptors. Was solid starting point guard for most of those years, and kind of nothing flashy, but serviceable option. And for a guy that you were able to find as an undrafted free agent from overseas, is you're never going to turn your nose up at that. Not, certainly a bargain. And he was really the only one out of the undrafted group in this
Yeah,
class.
why? Obviously, the NBA draft is shorter than the NFL draft, and so there are more potential players that would be quote unquote undrafted. Um, Obviously, look if you look at the hits in this draft, they're mostly towards the top. Even the players that weren't the superstar Hall of Famers, most of them are at the top. Certainly in the first round, and even in the first half of the first round. Why do you think the NBA draft is so much better, or do you think it's so much better at finding who the best players are pre-draft as opposed to the NFL, where you find superstars in the seventh round, and I think that happens in other sports as well.
I think a lot of times it seems like if you look at you're not getting a lot of these guys like in the NFL draft. You see a lot of guys coming from, maybe not a lot, but coming from these smaller schools where you really have to do your homework throughout the country. Where, as I feel like if you look at especially this draft, like the top of the draft, you see Syracuse, Georgia Tech, Marquette, Kansas, Texas, Georgetown. Like it's, you're not have to, turning over all these stones to find these marquee players. These are, playing for these blue blood programs. Obviously, teams in both sports are doing their due diligence, but I think at the end of the day, like, they're not having to go too far to, do their homework in these spots. Obviously, when it was, in the high school ranks, maybe it's a little more difficult, and it's hard to know what play. Obviously, LeBron was, absolute unicorn, but for most of the high school players, you truly don't know what they're gonna be. For every LeBron, there's obviously going to be 50 Kwame Browns. You just don't know what they're going to end up being. So, it's definitely very interesting to look at the disparity between the NFL and NBA.
Yeah. Okay, so we got to talk about the number 2 pick. We got to talk about Darko um, Milicic, because I think I feel like a whole book could be written about that pick, because it's so interesting. You have those 4 Hall of Famers there right at the top of the draft, and leading into the draft. Actually, if you look at draft big boards or whatever, there was a lot of debate between Darko Milicic and Carmelo Anthony. I think most people thought that they would be the number 2 and 3 pick in some order. Darko was this young phenom from Serbia, and actually had to have his practice when he was a teenager like canceled because of like bombings that were going on in Serbia. He'd been playing professional basketball since was 14 or something like that. Um, and the rules actually had to be changed for 2003 that allowed him to even get into the draft. He was he turned 18 like just a few days before the draft, and in previous years you had to be 18 when you registered for the draft, which was about a month and a half before the draft. And he wouldn't have met that deadline, and the rules were changed that year, such that you had to turn 18 in the year of the draft, and so he was just barely eligible for that draft. So he's one of the youngest players that's ever been drafted, because he was just barely 18 when the draft was held in June of 2003. And the other interesting thing about that pick is that the Pistons had that pick. And the Pistons were a good team. Usually the teams that draft at the top of the draft are terrible. But the Pistons had that pick from the Grizzlies thanks to a trade 6 years prior in 1997, where the Pistons traded Otis Thorpe to the Grizzlies for picks. I think that was they were dumping salary or something like that, and they ultimately get this number 2 pick. And so the Pistons were really good. They had Richard Hamilton and Ben Wallace and Chauncey Billups, and were in the Eastern Conference Finals that year. So they got a chance to do what the Thunder are doing right now, which is be really good and also keep drafting towards the top of the draft. Do you remember any buzz around Darko Milicic when the draft was rolling around that year?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely remember that there was a lot of debate with that pick. There was a lot of talk that they could potentially grab Carmelo at 2, or would they grab Milicic? And ultimately, obviously, they decided to grab Darko. He was kind of looked at a guy that hadn't even reached his potential yet, and was this uber young, kind of kid with untapped potential. This super clean guy that had a chance to be, they could bring him along, and he's already joining this team that is filled with these team oriented sensational players. I mean, that group. I mean, they already had brought, Tayshaun Prince was another one of those younger guys that they had brought along that ended up being a huge part of that '04 title team. You know, Milicic ended up being the youngest player to ever play in an NBA Finals game at the time, and which seems insane at just 18 years old to play in an NBA Finals game. Like I can't even imagine someone basically high school age is playing in an NBA Finals game. That just seems absolutely insane. But he just for whatever reason just it never translated. He just never played a ton of minutes, never clicked, and just ended up bouncing from team to team. And it never worked in Detroit, it never worked in Boston, it never worked anywhere that he ended up. And I mean, he played a handful of seasons, so probably made somewhat of a decent amount of money over the years, but was nowhere near you know probably one of the have to be categorized as one of the biggest busts in the history of the league, considering who was drafted after him. I mean, he's it's got to be in Sam Bowie territory, I would imagine.
Yeah, I mean, he made $53 million in the NBA, which not all of that was on his first contract, so he definitely got a second contract that was of some note. I mean, I think that the events surrounding that pick were so fascinating because, as we said, the Pistons were really good, and they were playing in the Eastern Conference Finals that year, and for whatever reason, the the lottery to decide the order of picks was held on June 22nd, which was right before, like, I think it was either at halftime or right before the game that the Pistons were playing against the New Jersey Nets. They ultimately got swept by that Nets team, but they were down 0-2 against the Nets, and they were playing in New Jersey. Um, and the draft order was being picked that night. And the pick that they had from Memphis was number one protected, so they were never going to get LeBron because if Memphis got the number one pick, then the Pistons wouldn't get that pick. So the best they could do was get number two. And as I think is fairly customary for teams, they warmed up, somewhere else earlier in that day. They didn't just show up at the arena and start playing a playoff game. They had a kind of shoot around workout, and they did it at John Jay College in New York. And at the same time that they were doing this warm up, Darko Milicic was at John Jay College in the other basketball court in that basketball arena, doing like sort of an impromptu workout for NBA executives and scouts and stuff. And so the Pistons were right there. Their whole team saw it. All of their executives, all of their coaches saw it. And it was allegedly, like, literally one of the best workouts that's ever been done by a pre-draft prospect. This guy who's like 7'1", out there shooting threes, ball handling skills, and is only 17 years old. I mean, he would have only been 17 at the time. And so I think they kind of got suckered into that pick. Not suckered necessarily because Darko had all the makings of an ultimately great player, but you had Dirk Nowitzki, who got drafted like 5 years prior, and so everybody was kind of searching for that next 7-footer that can move outside and shoot threes. So on the day that the draft order is being held, they watched this legendary workout by Darko Milicic. The whole Pistons staff is there. The whole team is there. You have to know that those Pistons players, peeked across the curtain and saw what Darko Milicic was doing. And then later that night, they go and play the Nets. They're down 0-2, so like they're thinking about what they might need in order to complete a championship team. And they hit the complete lottery. They get the number two pick. So I'm convinced. I don't know if it's true or not. I'm convinced that they decided that night that they were drafting Darko, having seen him earlier that day, and then losing to the Nets in Game 3. Jason Kidd's Nets team that was really really good. Um, I think that the pre-draft workout that Darko put on ultimately cemented him getting picked number two overall.
That I mean, that's an absolutely wild story, and I just feel like how do you not see that, and being that close to a championship be like, that's the missing piece for us. If you're seeing this 7-footer draining shots like that, I just don't know how you don't, your mind doesn't race to, that is the missing piece that we need. That's going to carry us, turn us into a dynasty for the next how many years. Like,
Yeah, and that's exactly what they needed, right? Like they had Ben Wallace, who was like a legendarily good defensive player, but really wasn't an offensive threat as a
no,
big. Um, they already had ball handlers that could make shots. Billups and Richard Hamilton certainly offered that, and so Carmelo might have been a little bit duplicative of what those players brought to the table. They needed a 7-footer that could really stretch the defense because they didn't really have it on their team at the time.
because I don't think they didn't have Rasheed Wallace at that point. I don't think, did
No,
they? I don't believe he was
no.
there quite yet. I think he was, because he ended up being the missing piece for that title team. Um, I believe they won it the following year, but he would have. I mean, if Milicic would have been what he showed in those workouts, it would have been, that would have been everything that they needed him to be. But obviously, it just didn't come to fruition. But that is an absolutely wild story.
Yeah, so I think if all those things hadn't happened on the same day, maybe they would have done more due diligence, and maybe they still make the same pick because, like I said, there was a lot of debate between Darko and Carmelo in that draft, and everybody with 2020 vision now says, well, obviously, Carmelo Anthony was the much better pick, and Darko would barely have been drafted. And I don't exactly know why it didn't ultimately work out for Darko. It really wasn't injury necessarily. I think it was just his skills never developed into an NBA level player.
Yeah, he definitely didn't have anything to do with injury. He, didn't translate to the American game, maybe for whatever reason. You know, he had different opportunities to have a change of scenery to see, maybe the Detroit scheme wasn't a fit for his skill set, but didn't work out. Playing with the Celtics, playing with the Magic, all these other stops along the way ended up, not working out. I mean, was, if he wasn't drafted number 2, would he be a fine like backup center? Sure, but obviously for where he's drafted, that is an absolutely colossal miss, and is probably one of the biggest misses in draft history in the NBA, I think.
Darko has, I think, jokingly, he certainly wouldn't call himself this, but he has one of the best nicknames I think in all of sports. I think he was joking because he only played limited minutes and only played in blowouts. I think he was jokingly called the human victory cigar because if he came in, one team was winning, one or the other team was definitely winning. So, how would you kind of summarize this draft, Chris?
Obviously, I'd say it's very, very top heavy. Obviously, the top 5 is, probably one of the best that has ever been seen. It's hard to argue with, 4 players that are Hall of Famers, and, you've got 2 guys that are on the top 10 all-time scoring list. You've got the all-time leading scorer in NBA history in LeBron. Um, you know, 4 of those players, were on the Redeem team in '08 that end up winning that Olympic gold medal, which I think is also very interesting. Um, you know, Obviously Bosh, Wade, and LeBron playing on the Heat to form the Big Three, winning a pair of titles. Also, kind of interesting that years later they end up playing together. Just, absolutely loaded. And, on top of that, also sandwiched in there is, the biggest bust probably in NBA history, give or take. And I think overall it's probably going to be more remembered for those 4 players that are Hall of Famers and how exceptional they were. And, this is probably one of the best draft classes that, has been seen definitely in recent memory, but maybe ever.
Yeah, I'm impressed by how right the teams got this one. Like 4 Hall of Famers is obviously a ton. If in any draft, you might be lucky to get 2 or 3 Hall of Famers that come out of it. So 4 is great, but to have 4 all at the top of the draft is pretty impressive by the scouts. So, Chris, do you want to preview for us what's coming up next week on BackDraft?
Yeah, so we're going to jump back to the NFL. As we said, we're going to kind of toggle back and forth each week. We're going to jump back to the NFL. We're going to do the 1999 draft. A lot of fun ones. This was one where there was one big, massive trade, probably one of the bigger ones that we've seen in NFL draft history, as well as a very interesting quarterback draft class that, had one very, very good quarterback and a lot of not so good ones. So that's going to be a really interesting one to break down.
Yeah, that one was my pick. I like that one because it heavily involves Mike Ditka, who I find to be a very interesting personality in the history of the NFL. Sort of right around when I graduated high school, so I remember Ricky Williams playing. I remember that draft fairly well, so I'm really looking forward to that one too. So, any parting words before we sign off for today, Chris?
No, I don't think so. Yeah, I mean, partially as an Eagles fan, I'm very interested in that one. Very excited to break that one down for that pick near the top of the draft. So that'll be a fun one to dissect. So I'm excited to dive into that one next week. And as always, thanks for joining us. And we'll see you next time here on Backdraft.
Next time. Later.
See ya.